Coffee. It can supposedly do everything from keeping us awake to preventing Parkinson's. But which ones are based in the actual science and which ones are just folklore? And is it the coffee or is it the caffeine that's actually more beneficial? So today, I, a drug scientist, am going to teach you everything you need to know about the beneficial effects of coffee so that the next time you are sipping your $7 latte, you can explain just why you're doing it. Now, we as a world are obsessed with coffee, and we've only been drinking more and more of it recently, as well as using it in other ways, so including things like coffee vapes and coffee enemas. Which, y'all, why? Now, we know that coffee helps a lot of different things, but there's also just a lot of hype about it too. So what does it actually work for? So first, we know that coffee helps with things like memory and attention, and it does not seem to just be the caffeine in it. So people have actually run the studies where they have had decaffeinated coffee, so coffee without the caffeine, although some decaf coffee actually still has some levels of caffeine. And what they found is that decaffeinated coffee actually improved memory. And in fact, they also found that just the smell of coffee could enhance your memory too. Now, my theory here is that that has something to do with state-dependent memory. So they've actually done studies where they've had people, for example, learn things underwater, and then they tested them above water or they tested them underwater, and they found that they remembered the information better underwater. So that state that you were in, whether that be underwater or stressed or smelling a certain thing, or in some cases drunk, that state can actually help you remember things better if you're back in that state again. So maybe just the smell of coffee reminds you of drinking coffee, and therefore you're more likely to remember things. Now, the effects of coffee and memory are actually pretty strong, and we can even see it with rats. So if you give them a freeze-dried coffee powder over their food, they will remember things better too. And this is true for alertness, not just for memory. Now, what about your mood? So this is how happy or sad you are at any specific point in time. So there are a lot of news headlines saying things like, oh, your morning coffee can make you happier. But we don't actually see this. This one is probably a myth. Now, there was a study that said that caffeine first thing in the morning makes you happier for the rest of the day, but there was no way to determine if that was actually joy being brought to you by the coffee, or is that just the coffee taking away your withdrawal symptoms from not having caffeine all night. Spoiler, it's probably just helping with your withdrawal. Now, what about depression? So there are a lot of studies that suggest that the more you drink coffee, the less likely you are to have depressive symptoms. Now, this is just a correlational relationship, but it seems to be pretty strong. So what they're suggesting is that with every extra cup of coffee you drink, you decrease your likelihood of having depressive symptoms by about 8%. But weirdly, it seems to be coffee here and not things like tea or caffeine. So there's something specifically about that coffee link. And we see this for other disorders too. So we see this for something like Parkinson's, which is my favorite thing to talk about because that's actually what I'm running a study on right now. I'm looking to see what aspects of coffee are linked to a decrease in Parkinson's symptoms, because we do see that the more you drink coffee, the less likely you are to develop Parkinson's later on in life. And we see this for Alzheimer's too. And in this case, it seems like the more you drink, the better. Now, we're not entirely sure what it is about coffee that's doing this. So we think it is at least partially driven by caffeine, but we think it has something to do with the other additional components in coffee too, like EHT, which is what I'm specifically studying. So I'm seeing if that caffeine plus the EHT is what's making coffee so great, and why caffeine is not as good as coffee seems to be. So stay tuned for my results 2 years from now. But what about the body side of things? So it seems like more coffee is actually linked to lower mortality rates. Now, I'm not saying that this is like a fountain of youth or anything, but in general, we do see that coffee has some kind of beneficial effects for the body. So it's linked to things like increased liver functioning and lowered risk of type 2 diabetes. And while it might increase things like blood pressure or heart rate while you're drinking it, it seems like it's linked to lower blood pressure over time. Now, higher rates of drinking coffee are also linked to things like a decreased risk of gout, as well as decreased risk of cancer. And it specifically seems like 2 types of cancer, so liver cancer and colorectal cancer. And it might be more protective for women than men, but we're not entirely sure. This is a very complex relationship. So people who are just like, yes, drinking coffee means that I'm never gonna get cancer, yeah, that's not a thing. Now, what about the problems associated with coffee? So first, let's just get some out of the way that people always ask about. Yes, coffee is a diuretic, so it is going to make you want to pee more. And yes, it actually does have some effects in the GI system that makes you also want to poop more. So it's basically doing this by stimulating the muscles in your colon. And it does this kind of similar to how much a standard meal does this. And decaffeinated coffee also does this, but it just does it a little bit more weakly than your standard coffee. So it seems like those other ingredients in coffee are at least partially causing this effect. So both of those things could be either pros or cons depending on your situation. But what about some actual negatives of coffee? The most obvious one is that it messes with your sleep. And we're talking about messes with your sleep for a while. So it actually basically delays melatonin production, and it's doing so that even 6 hours before you fall asleep, coffee can still have an effect. Which is why they tell you not to drink after like 4 p.m., but it depends on what time you're trying to fall asleep at. And how many of us are actually going to bed at 10 p.m.? Studies have also suggested that coffee might have some sort of link to cardiovascular issues, as well as a link to things like anxiety and blood pressure issues, but those are more like the acute effects. So this is not like long-term coffee. This is typically like you drink too much of it and now you have higher anxiety. Now your heart is beating too quickly. Now your blood pressure is raised. I'm not trying to diminish just how problematic those effects can be. As somebody with anxiety, this is why I do not drink coffee. Because if I drink coffee, it makes me physiologically anxious, and I do not like that feeling. And if you have a heart condition, your doctor is probably going to tell you not to be drinking caffeine too. There are also diterpenes in coffee, and these are linked to increased cholesterol. But this depends on the method that you're using to actually make the coffee. So boiled means that you typically have more diterpenes than something like filtered. I don't understand what those two things mean because I just told you that I don't drink coffee, but I'm guessing some of you understand what that means. So filtered might be better if you don't want to potentially increase the risk of having higher cholesterol. Now, coffee is also potentially problematic during pregnancy, and there's a debate about how much people should be drinking. So on average, it seems like people suggest below 200 milligrams per day, but there are also some studies that suggest that no caffeine is actually good during pregnancy because it's linked to things like low birth weight and miscarriage. But that is also something to talk to your doctor about. Really don't listen to me about pregnancy. I have 6 dogs and no kids. Now, finally, coffee and caffeine within it can be addictive. And there are some stats to suggest that over 50% of the people who are using caffeine, and specifically coffee, are actually addicted. Now, it's a pretty safe drug, so addiction is not that likely to do things like cause an overdose. It does mean that you're going to crave it, it does mean you're going to have withdrawal, and it does mean that you'll probably end up spending lots of money on it, which might be fine with you. That is your own choice. Now, in happy news, it does not seem like coffee is linked to things like ulcers or to things like acid reflux disease, which are commonly brought up as potential problems too. So while there are lots of coffee myths out there, there are also lots of benefits of coffee too. So feel free to use this to justify your own addiction.